afternoon, everybody. Depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. We still have some people joining but we will kickstart now. My name is Julia Caruso. I'm Cowater's head of programs based in London. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to this webinar focusing on leveling the playing field, SMEs, and the future of global trade. We're delighted to see participants joining us from across regions and different sectors, really reflecting the truly global relevance of today's topic. This is the second webinar in a series of discussions that Cowater has hosted, focusing on trade and the vital work that we do in this space with partners around the world, including some of our key clients like the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and Global Affairs Canada. Through this series, we aim to bring together practitioners, policymakers, and researchers to explore how trade can work better for inclusive growth and sustainable development. For those of you who may be less familiar with Cowater, we are a global international development consultancy with over 40 years of experience working in complex and diverse settings. We partner with governments, organizations, communities, civil society to design and implement sustainable solutions that generate lasting socioeconomic, financial, environmental impacts. Our trade and investment work focuses in particular on supporting SMEs, strengthening the enabling environment, and ensuring that trade really delivers tangible benefits for people and communities across the world. For this webinar, it's my pleasure to have my colleague John Karalis join me in moderating today's discussion with our distinguished panelists. John Karalis is Cowater's trade advisor. He has led major trade facilitation initiatives around the world. He has supported the WTO accession processes of Ethiopia, Somalia, and Uzbekistan, overseen the rollout of e-phyto systems in Madagascar, and designed programs to boost SME competitiveness in sub-Saharan Africa. As program director for the UK-funded Trade and Investment Advocacy Fund, John managed the program support to the WTO, working with key regional and developmental coalitions such as the Least Developed Countries Group, among a few, and advanced the agenda of the informal working group on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. John has also worked extensively on the Canadian Trade and Investment Facility for Trade and Development, where he further developed initiatives to increase micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises' participation in regional trading systems across the Asia Pacific and to really strengthen their integration into global value chains. Before I hand over to John, just some housekeeping rules for today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded and we will be able to share this following the session. To minimize disruptions, please could you ensure your webcam and microphone are turned off during the session? This should already be automatically done, but good to just double check that. We strongly encourage your questions throughout the discussion. Please use the Q&A box in Zoom to do this, not the chat box to submit any questions for the panelists. This just helps us track and respond to questions more effectively during the Q&A portion of the sessions. Sometimes the Q&A box is sneakily hidden, so we've added this screenshot, which hopefully you can all see on the screen, just to kind of show you how to find the Q&A box. On the Q&A chat, we encourage you to like or upvote with a thumbs up any questions that you like that are raised to help identify levels of interest in that specific topic or question. That way people are not repeating themselves. And then lastly, we may not be able to get to every question live, so apologies in advance for that, but we will do our very best to address as many as possible. So now, John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for that wonderful introduction and going through the housekeeping rules. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Karalis. I'm Cowater's trade advisor, and I'm very delighted to be today's moderator for our session on leveling the playing field, SMEs, and the future of global trade. SMEs in developing countries are critical for economic growth and prosperity, employing more than 70% of populations and contributing to more than 30% of GDPs. SMEs in developing countries, though, face many barriers in global trading system, including limited access to finance, complex regulations, weak digital infrastructure, and vulnerability to global shocks. These challenges restrict their ability to compete internationally and benefit from trade opportunities, particularly women-led SMEs. Despite these barriers, SMEs play a significant role in international trade by driving jobs and economic growth. SMEs are the heart of job creators, especially in developing countries. As if they're engaged in trade, they are more productive, profitable, and faster growing. SMEs play a significant role in strengthening global value chains. They act as the suppliers, subcontractors, and service providers to large exports, and they improve supply chain diversification, flexibility, and resilience. They also play a significant role in driving innovation and competitiveness. Exposure to international markets pushes SMEs to upgrade the quality and standards, adopt new technologies where possible, and innovate products and processes. And finally, SMEs play a significant role in enabling inclusive and sustainable trade. By integrating SMEs into regional development, it helps with regional development, poverty reduction, and fuels inclusive economic growth. Our webinar today brings together some of the leading trade and investment specialists to discuss how Cowater's products are helping to address not only the challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities for SMEs and what is being done to ensure they have a voice on the global stage. We will showcase real-world examples of trade reforms, policies, and the impact they can have on developing countries and the global trading system. Having now set the stage for today's discussion, I would like to introduce you to each of our panelists whom I've had the pleasure to work with over many number of years working here at Cowater. So it's a great honor I get to share the stage with them today. Our first panelist is the team leader for the Facilitating Inclusive, Resilient, and Sustainable Trade Project, Nadira Bayat. This project is funded by the Government of Canada, implemented by Cowater International in collaboration with the governments of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, and Zambia. Ms. Bayat brings 25 years of experience across the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development, leading policy research, program design, and multi-country project management. She has worked with several UN entities, including UNESCO, ITC, UNCTAD, UN Women, UNECA, ICJ, and ICTR, and has held senior positions in the South African government, including as Counselor for Multilateral Affairs at the South African Embassy in Washington, D.C. She specializes in sustainable development through digital inclusion, Gen-Z-responsive trade policy, and MSME development with a focus on advancing economic empowerment for women, youth, and persons with disabilities. She had advised governments on reducing inequalities and protecting marginalized groups with a strong record of translating research into policy reforms and strengthening institutional capacity in complex and fragile contexts. Welcome, Nadira. It's a pleasure to have you on today's panel.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our second panelist is our team leader for our Tasdeer program. And for those of you who don't know, Tasdeer is Arabic for exports. The Tasdeer program is a UK-funded $22.5 million trade facilitation and customs support program to the occupied Palestinian territories. Our team leader, Mr. Nour, is a seasoned international development professional, strategist, entrepreneur, and private sector expert with over 35 years of experience in leadership positions across international, private, and public sector organizations in the occupied Palestinian territories, Africa, and Australia. He was the executive director of Sharakat Co., a subsidiary of the Palestinian Investment Fund, where he led a $100 million flagship impact investment in agriculture, health, technology, and education. Prior to his work with Sharakat, he was seconded by the UK government as a private sector development advisor, while also holding several senior positions within the UK Department for International Development, now the FCDO, for over 12 years, including as policy lead for its multilateral support and as head of private sector development. Early in his career, Mr. Nour held several senior leadership positions at World Vision across Africa, Australia, and the Middle East. Welcome today, Nassim. It's a pleasure to have you on today's panel.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to John.
Our third panelist today is the Trade and Investment Director for the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development, Don Stephenson. Don began his public service career in 1979, working in cultural policy for 10 years at the Department of Communications. He moved into economic policy at Consumer and Corporate Affairs, Industry Canada, and Western Economic Diversification, before returning to cultural policy as Director General, Cultural Industries at Heritage Canada, where he led negotiations with the U.S. on the WTO split-run magazine dispute. He was appointed Director General, Trade Policy at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and then served 2 more years as Assistant Secretary to Cabinet, Economic and Regional Development Policy, Privy Council Office. In 2004, he was appointed Ambassador to the World Trade Organization, serving as chair of the goods negotiations in the Doha round until 2008. Don returned to become Assistant Deputy Minister of Trade Policy and Negotiations until his retirement in 2011, and continued to serve as Chief Negotiator for the Canada-India Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement until 2018. Don frequently lectures on trade policy, trade negotiations, and public policy development, and serves as Trade Investment Advisor to the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development. He is married to Jocelyn Belen and has 2 children, and I'm told I have to emphasize this, but I feel there's a story here. In square brackets, 2 grandchildren. Welcome, Don. It's a pleasure to be alongside you on this panel today. Our final presenter, our final panelist today is the Geneva lead for the Trade and Investment Advocacy Fund 2+, or CAF 2+ program, which is an FCDO-funded global trade facilitation program. I'm very delighted to welcome Alicia Greenwich. Ms. Greenwich is an international trade expert with over 25 years of extensive experience in international trade negotiations and WTO practices and procedures. She is the founder and president of an expert trade and advisory practice in Geneva, Switzerland, Summit Alliance International Development Trade Solutions, or SAI, which she established in 2009. Ms. Greenwich served for 10 years as Assistant Deputy Chief of Mission in Geneva, Senior Counsel and Trade Negotiator for the U.S. government before the WTO on several trade issues, including and not limited to service trade negotiations, trade-related intellectual property, the first electronic commerce declaration at WTO, trade remedies, dispute settlement, and deliberations before a number of WTO bodies. As mentioned, since founding Summit Alliance in 2009, Ms. Greenwich has led their work primarily as an in-house trade advisory and support service to developing country and least developed country delegations, as well as the ACP and LDC groups at the WTO. A distinct characteristic of their work is the ability of their team to adapt to new realities and challenges in the global trading sphere. Recent examples of this are her and her team have been working on analysis to develop submissions and draft ideas for possible ministerial consideration at the upcoming Ministerial Conference 14 that will be held this year on electronic commerce and WTO reform. In addition, as 2025 was a tumultuous year globally, her team were the first responders with analysis and customized data on the impact of cross-cutting unilateral tariffs imposed by the U.S. that created unpredictable conditions and new challenges for the ACP and LDC WTO members. Welcome, Alicia. It's a pleasure to have you on this panel.
Thanks, John.
With all these panelists, all these projects we've highlighted here, our session today will focus on 2 topics. We'll start by looking today first at the inclusive growth opportunities for SMEs before moving into a discussion on the global trade architecture, some of the challenges and opportunities. As mentioned at the beginning, I encourage everybody, if they have questions throughout the session for our presenters, please drop them into the question and answer box. And the more likes we get, the higher those questions come up the list. So we will look to answer your questions at the end of today's session. To start off today's session, I would like to launch into a discussion with all of our panelists to learn a little bit more about some of the work that is being done by Cowater on inclusive growth opportunities for SMEs. SMEs in developing countries can drive inclusive growth by integrating into global value chains and empowering women and youth entrepreneurs. These opportunities not only boost productivity and employment, but also reduce inequality and foster sustainable development. To meaningfully participate in international trade, SMEs in developing countries need a level playing field, which can be achieved by improving access to markets and regulatory reforms. Cowater, through its projects, as you'll hear today, is at the forefront of leveling that playing field for SMEs. In this portion of the webinar, each of our panelists will provide an overview of their project, the challenges SMEs are facing in their particular area of focus, and how the projects are adapting to improve the opportunities and outcomes for SMEs. I would like to start by asking our first panelist today, Nadira, as the team leader on the first project. I was wondering if you could start us off with an overview of some of the work the first program is doing, while focusing on what are some of the key challenges SMEs are facing in the three countries covered by your program: the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, and Zambia.
Thank you very much, John, and warm greetings to everyone who are joining us for today's webinar. As John mentioned, I'm Nadira, and I'm the team leader of the Facilitating Inclusive, Resilient, and Sustainable project, better known as FIRST. So, John, just a little bit more about FIRST. Well, FIRST is a 5-year program that's funded by Global Affairs Canada, and of course, as you mentioned, implemented by Cowater International. And we work in close partnership with the governments of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, and Zambia. Now, the development objective is really to strengthen the enabling environment for inclusive trade in these countries, with a focus on small-scale cross-border traders and MSMEs. Now, particularly those MSMEs led by women, youth, and persons with disabilities. And the project works through three very tightly linked result areas: on policy, on practice, and on evidence. Now, first, when we look at policy reform, we're looking at supporting the governments of these three countries in translating national and regional trade commitments, including under the historic African Continental Free Trade Area, its protocols on women and youth in trade and digital trade, into concrete, tangible trade and development policies and complementary measures that reduce gender, social, and disability inclusion and barriers for MSMEs. We're also looking at trade access in practice and focusing on improving how trade works on the ground, especially for our women, youth, and PWD-led MSMEs, particularly at complex borders like Kasumbalesa between the DRC and Zambia. So small firms can actually trade, can compete and scale. And thirdly, we are looking at evidence. How do we strengthen the availability and use of GEDSI, gender equality, disability, social inclusion, trade data, so that policies are informed by real experiences and be implemented and monitored effectively. Now, together, you'll see how these pillars reinforce each other, because better evidence leads to better policy. Better policy enables participation. Participation allows SMEs to grow, integrate into value chains, create jobs, contribute to sustainable development. Now, of course, there are challenges, and our evidence from our baseline assessments, our regular engagement with policymakers, with SMEs, with trade associations, are all pointing to a clear conclusion. SMEs are the backbone of the economies in these three countries. They are central to inclusive economic growth and lie at the heart of national development priorities. But they are a set of systemic and reinforcing constraints that continue to limit their competitiveness, their ability to trade, and their capacity to scale. Now, first, we're looking at non-tariff barriers and custom inefficiencies. These overly complex trade procedures remain a major obstacle, particularly at complex, high-volume borders like Kasumbalesa. We see that SMEs face fragmented regulatory oversight across multiple agencies, duplicative documentation requirements, and inefficient border processes. We also see how SMEs struggle with compliance and when it comes to standards and regulations. Our research shows us that women, youth, and persons with disability-led enterprises are often concentrated in perishable goods and fast-moving consumer products, but they lack the skills, the certifications, the quality infrastructure needed to meet sanitary and phytosanitary and technical requirements. Access to finance is a massive constraint. It's a binding constraint on SME growth. And we see that this constraint is really excluding our MSMEs led by women, youth, and persons with disabilities from formal credit, from insurance and export guarantees. And even when finance does exist, there are opportunities for access to finance. This information is just not accessible in practice. Of course, digital trade is a priority. There's massive opportunity, but unequal access. So here, our digital needs assessments are showing us that connectivity, affordability, appropriate devices, and digital literacy and skills remains a massive challenge. At the same time, we're seeing that online harassment, cyber risks, and digital-based gender violence are emerging as digital non-tariff barriers that is discouraging participation in e-commerce, in social commerce, in digital payments, and that impacts women entrepreneurs disproportionately. So when you asked about what the program is doing and planning to do to improve opportunities and outcomes, many. But I'm just going to try and go very quickly through this. As I mentioned, we're working across policy reform, practical tools, skills, and evidence to be able to unlock opportunities for SMEs to upgrade, to trade, and to scale. So we're looking at improving the regulatory environment so that trade rules work for SMEs. In Zambia, for example, this includes targeted support to review trade and export policy instruments, to identify concrete reforms, such as streamlining business registration, simplifying tax and customs procedures, reducing duplicative license and documentation, and strengthening SME access provisions in public procurement. We're also developing very practical toolkits that translate these regulatory requirements into step-by-step guidance that SMEs can actually apply in practice. We're also strengthening the capabilities of SMEs to compete and access markets. Now, here we're looking at how to improve core business skills, bookkeeping, business management, financial literacy, social commerce, designed around the realities of SMEs that are also juggling trade, that are juggling caregiving and other livelihood responsibilities. How do we make SMEs in these countries digital and AI ready? We want to leave no one behind. So it's really important that they also grow with technology and they understand how to use simple data tools, digital platforms, things that we take for granted to grow and to scale. Evidence, again, for expanding pathways into higher value added activities and regional value chains. We want to use our research to be able to identify where SMEs can realistically upgrade. We will be scaling delivery going forward with MSME ministries and partners through market-focused training on standards, on packaging, on facilitating linkages to buyers and regional supply chains. We also want to be able to improve access to finance. Of course, we're not going to be able to provide this, but information. We want to be able to generate evidence on why finance is so, may be available, but it's just not accessible to women, youth, and persons with disability-led enterprises. So we're convening policy dialogues that put SMEs, financial institutions, and regional actors, development finance institutions and banks in the same room and really improves access to information on small loans, on savings schemes and youth and friendly instruments. And lastly, John, just very quickly, we want to be able to ensure that digital tools are accessible and because they're so essential for SMEs to reach beyond local markets. So in partnership with Trademark Africa, first is piloting the Isoko digital platform in Kasumbalesa, Zambia, that's really providing real-time price and demand information to help SMEs coordinate with buyers and suppliers. But as part of this digital skills, literacy, and of course the need to address online violence, on cybersecurity risk, recognizing the digital non-tariff barriers are particularly harmful and impact disproportionately on women. So yes, very quickly, I hope that I'm still in time, according to the time that you allocated for this. But yes, we want to be able to ensure that we have systems that work together across rules, capabilities, finance, digital access. So trade becomes a realistic pathway for growth and really enables SMEs in the three countries that we're working in DRC, in Zambia, and Mozambique, to build businesses that create jobs, that drive innovation and sustain livelihoods. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Nadira. Very, very interesting product. And as you said, as you mentioned right off the top, SMEs are the backbone of economies, and I think that's a very important point. And it's very interesting to see how the first project is addressing many of the systemic constraints with the evidence and policy-based discussion. So very, very helpful to know more about some of the interesting work that is being done in sub-Saharan Africa. With that, I would like to maybe turn to our next panelist and give us a view into another region of the world. I would like to turn to Nassim next and maybe ask him to provide us a bit of an overview of the Tasdeer program, and very similar to provide us an overview of some of the challenges facing SMEs in Palestine, and what the program is specifically doing or planning to do to help improve not only opportunities but outcomes for SMEs in Palestine. Nassim, over to you.
Thank you, John. Greetings from Ramallah in Palestine. Tasdeer, as John said, means exports, but it's doing much more than exports. The design has evolved over the past 5 years because of the flexibility that was built within it. Because we learned that if you want to work with the private sector, you have to be as flexible as the private sector. So it is a 5-year program funded by FCDO with a value of £22.5 million. It is led by Cowater International in partnership with a local Palestinian consortium, BIS Core and Al-Athar in Gaza. As you know, we work in a very fragile political environment in the West Bank and Gaza. The objective is to improve trade performance, product competitiveness, and customs capabilities. This is to strengthen the resilience of the SMEs, Palestinian SMEs, and enable them to grow in the West Bank. And now, after 2 years of war in Gaza, to enable post-war early recovery of SMEs in Gaza. As a way of definition, just within the Palestinian context, SMEs constitute 99% of Palestinian businesses, and they are defined as businesses employing up to 25 people and having under 7 million of annual turnover. As in every other economy, SMEs are the backbone of the economy. And despite the destruction of almost everything in Gaza the past 2 years, for example, we see that SMEs are the first responders to early recovery after the ceasefire in Gaza. So how do we do that? How do we work? We work by addressing the root causes for market failure for SMEs, which are mainly the impediments at the policy, institutional, and firm level. Our goal is, one, to see the Palestinian Authority contributing to better enabling environment for businesses to thrive and grow, facilitating trade, enabling investment, and the general aspects of doing business. So that's at the policy level. In Palestine, we also have private sector institutions, which are democratically elected representative bodies, and those have a role to play. So we work with them. Example, the Standards Institute, the trade entities, the unions, the representative bodies. We work with them to improve their value proposition and their sustainability. And last but not least is we work with firms, of course. These are the final objective, to improve their products and take more risk to venture into developing new products and new market. And we use blended approach of technical assistance and cost-sharing grants in our partnerships. Over the past years, we usually met and exceeded all of our outputs, but we measure our success mainly by related return on investment type of outcomes, such as sales and exports, number of policies adopted and enacted, and so forth. For example, the past 5 years, we've invested less than $2 million with 24 SMEs through cost-sharing grants, and we're able to claim over 30 million of increased sales and exports, and to crowd in more than 9 million of private sector investments. Moving to the challenges facing SMEs in the Palestinian territories, maybe it's surprising to people, but the fact that we are 99%, that 99% of the economy is SMEs is a challenge in itself, because it restricts the ability to achieve economies of scale and to invest in high productive facilities. In our opinion, a healthy economy should have like 60 to 70% of SMEs, not 99%. The second challenge is total destruction of livelihood and infrastructure in Gaza over the past 2 years. 2 million people living and working out of tents and partially demolished structures. GDP in Gaza contracted by 84%, and in the West Bank declined by 13%. Chronic high cost of trade due to man-made movement and access restrictions, mainly by the Israeli occupation. Before the war, Gaza was under economic siege since 2007, with every product and person entering and exiting Gaza being subjected to huge scrutiny and restrictions. In the West Bank, trade routes within the West Bank and into the world are fully controlled by Israeli military checkpoints and crossings, with very complex procedures limiting any business from reaching their full potential. Right now, for example, and for most of the past year, King Hussein Bridge, which is the only crossing we have to Jordan and into the east, has been shut down by the Israeli government, with no trade in or out. 1.6 billion of private sector arrears to the government, which is unable to pay them to the private sector because Israel is withholding customs and clearance revenues from the PA. So a normal government would import goods and they would impose, customs and clearance revenue. They should use them to pay salaries. Palestinian authorities unable to do that. Over 2 billion of that money is being held by Israel. And so the private sector and mostly SMEs who are selling to the government have to bear that cost, and that raises their working capital requirements. Low purchasing power in the West Bank due to lack of public salaries. About more than 150,000 public servants are not getting paid or partially paid, and lack of revenue from workers in Israel after the war, who were bringing in about $15 million a day. Most importantly, high cost of industrial inputs, since almost everything has to come either from or via Israel. This includes water, electricity, raw material, everything else almost. So this is really to frame the high constraints that we're living in, and how SMEs continue to be resilient despite all, and are literally being resurrecting from under the tents in Gaza and surviving in the West Bank. So what is the program doing about it? Of course, we've been working over the past 5 years, so we survived Corona and then 2 years of war. So we had to move up and down, southern, right and left, to be responsive. But I'll just give some examples of what we're doing. So since we talked about Gaza, in Gaza, for instance, we're working now with the Federation of Industries, one of the institutions that I mentioned, to create first mini clusters for light manufacturing SMEs who are starting, who are resurrecting their businesses. And we're starting with carpenters, simple light manufacturing trade that is needed, profession that is needed to actually rebuild houses, fix a door, put a table back. Those are the first responders. So we see SMEs wanting to work together. So we are creating the first cluster of that. And soon we'll be moving to aluminum and other clusters. We're also working to restore agriculture and food security in Gaza by rehabilitating greenhouses and water systems and get fresh food back on Gaza tables. In the West Bank, we are investing with SMEs to share the risk of developing more competitive products and to explore new and regional and international markets. We're also working with those who wish to strengthen domestic production. So while we believe in international trade, but we know we're not very competitive because of the high cost of inputs. So we have started moving into how we can strengthen domestic production and reduce reliance on inputs. To reduce the cost of energy, we've also launched solar energy installation projects to encourage businesses to move into green energy and reduce reliance on expensive energy from Israel. We also work with several ministries to improve their trade and economy-related policies. We work with the standard institutes to ensure that their standards are not only on par with international standards, but that they are also accredited and mutually recognized by target markets, such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and all that. Finally, I'd just like to say that Jesse is an important pillar of our work, and that we look at Jesse in a slightly different way. While we think that Jesse, yes, is a marginalized group of people that we need to support and strengthen and all that, but we actually look at them more as assets to the economy, without whom the economy will not achieve its potential. So when we talk to businesses, we try to show them evidence of how women can actually improve your revenue, of how disabled people can actually be more reliable workers in the workplace. And we show them numerical evidence from around the world. I'll stop here, but that's a snapshot of what we're doing and how we do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nassim. A very, very interesting project, and seems like a very challenging environment to work in. But I think based on the challenges that you've highlighted and how the project's addressing them, very similar to what Nadira was mentioning, we're seeing some common threads come across, whether it's in Africa, in the sub-African continent, or in Palestine, in that the common threads are that these projects are working to improve trade policy. We're working more with evidence and helping to get to the heart of some of the key challenges that both of you have highlighted today. To sort of give another perspective on how Cowater's projects are working with SMEs and basically supporting the growth of SMEs and really working with as we've talked about today, the backbone of economies, I would invite Dawn to come online and talk a little bit more about how the EDM project is. How the EDM project does its work, but also what it's doing to address some of the key challenges facing many of the SMEs that it's doing through its work. And of course, the follow-up question that all of our presenters have been asking today is that what is the program doing or has done in the past or planning to do to improve opportunities and outcomes for SMEs?
Thanks, John. And this time I've put on my microphone. So if you don't know about the EDM, you're forgiven. It's a relatively small trade technical assistance project, but I would argue an interesting and effective model to build on, and has advanced Canada's dual policy goals, increasing the development impact of trade agreements with Canada and diversifying Canada's export markets. As the name suggests, the project provides expertise, not necessarily Canadian, to help ODA-eligible countries negotiate, implement, and benefit from trade agreements. The project has delivered 106 technical assistance activities, trained over 6,700 government officials and over 1,100 private sector officials. We've helped draft laws, regulations, policies, and establish new programs and procedures. Assistance is demand-driven, and special attention is given to promoting gender equality, inclusiveness, and environmental sustainability. The support for negotiating and implementing trade agreements was, I believe, highly effective, while at the same time relatively simple to deliver. It was delivered relatively quickly, just-in-time independent advice to trade negotiators, tailored to the development needs and circumstances of the beneficiary country. The focus was narrow, specific negotiating issues, and the cost was modest. The support for implementing agreements was also effective, again, focused on specific commitments in the agreement and relatively straightforward. Implementation assistance tended to be somewhat longer activities, and as in the case of negotiation support, necessarily targeted to government ministries and agencies. Those of you who worked in trade policy know that many of the commitments developing countries make in trade agreements are never fully implemented because they can't unless they get support. Support to help developing countries and in particular SMEs, benefit from trade agreements was more challenging. The need is huge, and assistance activities often seem like trying to boil the ocean. EDM's strategy was to focus on trade support organizations, both public and private sector, to strengthen their capacity to provide continuing support to companies. I'm a recovering trade negotiator, and I have to confess, I wasn't always sufficiently mindful that when the negotiation is over, it's not over. Trade agreements don't do anything until somebody uses them. You need trade-ready entrepreneurs and companies. And for SMEs, that means giving them assistance. So your second question, what are the challenges faced by SMEs in Southeast Asia and South America? In my experience, I would say that the challenges are pretty much the same everywhere. The central challenge for small businesses is that they're small. They don't have a lot of people and they don't have a lot of money or assets against which to borrow money to finance trade activities. They often don't have people with export training who know how to assess export readiness, how to develop an export strategy, packaging, logistics, marketing, risk management, and all the rest. They don't have an accounting department to track and record the cost of inputs to satisfy the product-specific rules of origin, where the real protectionism happens. They don't have marketing experts to do market intelligence studies, and they don't have the money to hire McKinsey to do it for them. They don't have foreign offices and can't afford trade missions to find buyers and investors. They don't have experts on sustainability standards to meet the ever-increasing demands of developed countries, governments and consumers. They don't have the money to bridge export costs to payments from buyers. So they need support programs and policies, export training, including on product standards, export finance, including insurance against financial risk, advisory services, including commercial attaches who can prepare market intelligence briefs, support to participate in trade missions, matchmaking services, etc. EDM has provided training in most of these areas to government ministries and private sector organizations, which brings me to another challenge, the high turnover in staff in the public sector, who receive experience and training and then leave for better wages in the private sector. Knowledge transfer is good, but the challenge that creates for technical assistance is sustainability. EDM has tried to address this by ensuring that our experts leave behind training tools, courses, lesson plans, manuals, guides, and that they include a train-the-trainer component in their technical assistance activities. For very small businesses, the way to global markets is often through collective action, shared services, collective production, distribution, and marketing. EDM has supported collective action for agricultural producers, artisans, community tourism service providers in Vietnam, Colombia, Paraguay, Ecuador. The focus, though, of the EDM program is trade agreements. And very often SMEs don't take advantage of trade agreements because they don't know they exist. The first job is to make them aware of the opportunities, the preferential tariffs, the regulatory certainty, investment protection, etc. EDM has supported dozens of activities to raise awareness of the obligations and opportunities of trade agreements. However, trade agreements are also complicated and costly to use. Even when they are aware of preferential tariffs, many SMEs satisfy themselves with the MFN tariff because the margin of preference isn't big enough to warrant the cost of compliance with the FTA rules. That's an incomplete list, but it's all I can do with the time I've been given and my fading memory. John?
Thank you very much, John. Very, very insightful. And I think even as you say with your fading memory, you've highlighted some very important elements there in that, that the EDM project does support trade negotiations and particularly SMEs. And we once again come back to evidence. So understanding that there are these agreements there, what's in these agreements and how they can benefit SMEs. And we did talk about the need for more training training supports, advisory services are very critical elements that I think have come across in all the presentations today. So thank you, Don, for that window into the EDM program. I'm sure we could probably spend much more time talking about it, but I want to give our final panelists the opportunity to actually talk a little bit more, as Don pointed out, supporting the trade negotiations and actually trade negotiations within the World Trade Organization. Our final panelist, Elisa, who's the Geneva lead on the TAF2 Plus program, works within the WTO and does provide support to many groups like the ACP group, the LDC group within the Geneva context. So maybe I could turn to you, Alicia, to give us a little snapshot of what the TAF2 Plus program is doing to support the WTO. And very similar questions posed for other panelists is that from your perspective in supporting these groups and the discussions that are happening within the WTO, what are some of the challenges that are coming through in many of these negotiations at the WTO for SMEs? But also, how has the TAF2 Plus program been utilized, deployed at the WTO to improve the opportunities and conditions to address these challenges for SMEs?
Thanks, John. Well, I think taking holistically all of your questions into one, just to say the context, and you heard a bit of an iteration of that from Ambassador Stephenson, who, he has been in this beat before. But what I would say about the focus here, and this has been largely this type of activity that we're doing here is very much on the ground, demand driven as well, daily, day-to-day interaction with the representatives of the governments where largely their enterprises are SMEs. And I was listening to Nassim about the 99% of SME not really being healthy, but perhaps 60 to 70%. But when we provide in our teams of experts who are covering various different issues that are considered priorities, shared priorities of the two main groups you mentioned, John, is the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group and the least developed countries group. These groupings, ACP having 66 members who are members of the WTO, and the LDC group around 40 or so, and it keeps increasing with accession. And yes, John, thanks for your groundwork with Timor-Leste during their accession, because that is another, them along with Comoros became new members of the WTO and also new members of the ACP and the LDC groups. Now, what that also demonstrates is, notwithstanding what we're hearing in the world climate today, whether it was us navigating through COVID and keeping countries engaged through new mechanisms that they were not that familiar with, such as our webinar here, they found a way to keep engaging with each other with our assistance and bringing in tools that allowed them to negotiate and be able to negotiate in both English and French, that tends to be very difficult to do. But what the World Trade Organization represents for all of these countries is an investment. They may receive assistance and backup support from different partners, but they are investing their time and the individuals that come and sit in Geneva. During COVID, many of them were ready to pack their bags and leave, but we found a way for them to continue engaging before the World Trade Organization figured out how to do online meetings and negotiations during the COVID year. But I would say that our program, similar to what Don has reflected in the EDM, they are not geared granularly to SMEs, but the countries are small compared to the other members of the WTO. So they in and of themselves are the SMEs of the governments that participate on a daily basis, and they must come to the table, which is in constant negotiation, constant deliberation mode at the Geneva-based ambassador level and at the ministerial level, which culminates in the highest lawmaking body effectively of the World Trade Organization at the ministerial level every 2 years. Now, there is this challenge in the WTO called consensus, but what has been clear that the agreements that were negotiated in 1995, and there was a lot of buy-in from developing countries, there was still yet some open wounds that needed to be dealt with in different cycles and collapses and cycles again of progress. But the delegations of these countries, these groups, stay the course. They cannot negotiate or even deliberate, attend meetings and interact and react to different proposals and suggestions without having a regular backup of advisors who are feeding factual information, evidence coming from their regions. They deliberate themselves internally, so therefore consensus is happening in their two groups, without which they wouldn't engage very much in the World Trade Organization. So this type of support has been funded by different partners over time, but in Geneva to us, and more lately, and the lengthiest commitment to that support has been through the TAF2 program led by Cowater, which is the TAF2 program being a UK program, and you see how the UK is very vested in keeping that partnership and understanding those needs. So this is the arena of policymaking, legal commitments, binding commitments, negotiating new commitments, and implementation of those commitments. And coming back to some of what Don was saying, the countries are not ready to walk out of the WTO, yet they are the most vulnerable to whatever hiccups are happening. They want access to global markets. They want global value chains, and they are talking to each other in Geneva and regional levels as well as bilateral level. Examples of what this program has done is to show how we will constantly be on call to assist with drafting of language that's needed tomorrow in a meeting. And these negotiations are not just happening in some big, writ large negotiating mandate. They're happening in the regular body meetings. These are what we call deliberative discussions. And delegations are going in exchanging information about what they're doing at home. So the feedback that they need from their SMEs, for example, is just not necessarily coming. So we have to work with other organizations, for example, UNCTAD and a few other entities, even OECD, we push the countries, the delegations themselves, to ask questions back to their capitals, to speak directly to their SMEs, to speak directly to their trade associations. We're about to launch a link, and we've come up with a list of doing our own research of different trade associations and export promotion boards in the services sector, where some LDCs that come to Geneva, they're only capable in the UN side. They have to attend meetings on the UN side as well as the World Trade Organization. But they found out fast, very quickly, how the World Trade Organization is not where you go and you can make very strong, eloquent interventions, which may be very important about principles and policies at the UN. But in the WTO, everything that comes out of your mouth can be rendered a commitment if it's on the record. And then you have actual agreements which have been signed by their stakeholders, endorsed and signed by their ministers at home. If we look at what happens with a developed country, whether it's Canada, the US, or the EU, or India, China, most of these delegations, they are coming from the trade teams in the capitals. So they're trade experts, most of them. And they still receive interventions for different meetings, which could be tons of them that happen every day, every month. They receive instructions from the relevant bodies, the specialized bodies in their capitals. Whereas African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, LDCs, don't have that kind of backup every day. They don't have that kind of prioritization in the capitals. The Geneva-based officials that are following the various meetings that are happening on a regular basis at the WTO and have impact on for SMEs relating to trade costs, reducing trade costs. For example, the trade facilitation agreement was a big win for our team in helping drafting certain provisions that could unlock the deal that happened in Bali in 2013, also funded by the UK. More recently, it's also impacting, in addition to the economic side, it's small fishermen who don't have access to the level of fish stocks that they would normally have because of large, very shockingly damaging subsidies that major, about five or six of them, I could say, are feeding into fish factories that are sucking up all the main fish resources, including along the economic zones of small nations that have mainly small fisher folk. And so we have a landmark agreement, which these groups were very much a part of drafting text into and can recognize their fingerprints in the agreement that was entered into force last year, which was concluded in 2022. So this is just to give a flavor of the kind of role we play, but in the role that we play, we are not replacing the capital-based officials who should be upgraded. How long would it take to do that? We are also giving them tools to communicate back with their organizations, their not just their ministries, but the export promotion boards and the trade associations that include SMEs. And I close there just to say that alongside of everything I just said, there is an informal process, an informal working group called the SMEs group, and they are voluntarily coming together, showcasing different SMEs across developing countries, across all countries, because as we are finding in the work that we are doing, led by TAF2 and Cowater, is that we are finding much more cross communication between small state SMEs and bigger state SMEs, developed country states. There is more going on informally between themselves that they're just not bothered to inform governments. So it is important when the WTO holds its sessions on MISMEs, meaning led by members across all levels of development. This information is highly enlightening and highly encouraging for what then gets translated into binding commitments at the WTO. And there's a direction now to look at not only binding commitments, but perhaps some commitments that are a little softer, voluntarily taken on, soft law, so to speak, but one that members can voluntarily take on, bind themselves, and still keep engagement in the multilateral bodies at the WTO, which are highly active and highly engaged. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Lisha. A very interesting snapshot and sort of a reframing and looking at it from the WTO perspective. And I really like that, talking about how countries are the SMEs in the WTO, especially the ones that you work with on a day-to-day basis, but highlighting some of the key points many have been talking about, the advisory services needed and evidence. Before we jump to our second topic of the day, I just want to throw out a quick reminder to all our participants. If you do have any questions for our panelists today, please do throw it in the question and answer box. We'll try to get as to many questions as possible at the end of the session. Our next topic, we'll be looking at the global trade architecture. Very keen to have our panelists answer some of the audience questions, so I might do a bit of a lightning round. I'll throw a couple questions at you, and very quickly, our panelists, if they can succinctly answer some of the questions put towards them. But just to sort of frame the discussion on the global trade architecture right now is that what we're seeing today is sort of a fragmentation of global trade rules. There's rising protectionism and geopolitical frictions, which are undermining the rules-based multilateral system, making it harder for least developed countries to secure fair access to markets and have a meaningful say on the global stage. A multilateral system weighted towards developing countries does not result in fair and inclusive multilateral trading system and is detrimental to global economic growth. But to achieve this fairness and inclusive multilateral trading system, all members need to feel incentivized to participate in the rules-based system. So I would like to put forward maybe one question right away. So now that we've talked about many of the challenges that SMEs face, we've looked at Sub-Saharan Africa, Palestine, we've looked at Southeast Asia, South America through the EDM program, and also looked at some of the challenges at the WTO. But maybe I want to put this question forward to our presenters today is that What further support do SMEs need to be able to meaningfully participate in international trade? As this is a lightning round, I'd ask all our panelists to maybe keep it to 2 minutes to allow us time to answer some of the questions that are coming through. So maybe I could start with Alicia once again. Maybe you could kick us off here in an answer. So in your opinion, and through the work that you're doing in the TAF 2 Plus program, what support do SMEs need to be meaningfully participating in international trade? Very quickly.
I would just echo what Don said. They need to be aware, and they need to be aware of how, not just the what.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And then maybe I can turn to Dawn.
Well, in terms of technical assistance, I think less might be more. I would argue for fewer projects, fewer beneficiaries, but longer assistance for greater impact. Some of the best outcomes we've had in EDM has been from assistance activities that had multiple phases, a needs assessment phase, a training and tools development phase, and then a mentorship of officials in their early application of the training in their work. And in many of our activities, we would have liked to be able to take the beneficiary to, the next step, to the next level, to ensure that the capacity was fully installed. I also think that we need to find ways to get the private sector more engaged because that's where the money is. So we should support partnerships, facilitate partnerships at all levels, government to government, business to business. And some of the EDM outcomes that I've been most pleased with were where we established a continuing working relationship between counterpart organizations in Canada and the beneficiary country.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Don. And maybe I guess sum it up, less is more. But I think it's a very valid point you raised there that the private sector engagement is a critical part in building more of those partnerships because we need to go where the money is. And I think that's a very, very valid point. Maybe I can turn to our next panelist, Nassim, to get your thoughts on what further support do SMEs need to be able to meaningfully participate in international trade from your perspective on the Tasdeer program?
Thank you, John. I actually agree with Don. I was going to talk about donors often bring their money and bring their experts, but I think SMEs learn from other SMEs and other businesses better than from us. And therefore, I always encourage donors to bring their own private sector and investors and to encourage more business to business and also to open their own markets to the products of those countries we're trying to work. So, and also inspired by one of the questions, like the role of diaspora, many of the countries we work in have huge diaspora that have decided to leave that country because it's so bad. And they live in the donor country, many of them. How can we bring those together? Those would be the first that we would bring together. The second thing that I would say that we need to help SMEs more in is how to work together more collaboratively and not competitively. And like I said, with 99% SMEs in my country, there is no way to achieve economies of scale unless people work together, unless people start buying together, unless people start investing together to buy these big machines where they can compete and then at the industrial level and achieve economies of scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nassim. And I think what we're seeing is a common thread is that we need that private sector engagement, but also to work more collaboratively, not competitively once again, and also bringing in, some of the diaspora and having them, advocate and participate in this. Turning to our last but certainly not last panelist, Nadira, thoughts from your side on what further support SMEs need to be able to meaningfully participate in international trade from your perspective on the first program?
Yeah, thanks, John, for that important question. And I think information is key. Better business, trade, and market information and intelligence. What we're seeing for SMEs in our three countries, in the DRC, Mozambique, and in Zambia, is that they're failing not because markets don't exist, but because information doesn't exist. So SMEs really need accessible, trusted, intelligence on prices, demand, product requirements, regulatory changes, so that markets become more transparent, more accessible, and less risky. When small firms better understand where the opportunities are, what quality, what SPS requirements apply, how the rules are changing, and how they can make more informed decisions, I think we'll really be able to see SMEs, particularly in first countries, being able to unlock new trade opportunities. But this information has to be timely, it has to be practical, and it has to be usable. Thanks.
Very insightful inputs, Nadir, and I think you're very right that the information, particularly trade information, needs to be easily accessible, easily digestible for SMEs to maximize the opportunities for trade. As many of our participants have been eagerly listening today to our session, I think there are quite a few questions coming in. So I would invite all our panelists today to turn on their camera, and we will go to the question and answer portion of today's session. And maybe just looking through the questions, I will throw the first one out. Looking at this and maybe a follow-on question to sort of our conversation with Alicia is that how do LDCs and ACP countries counteract the stick without the carrot approaches we are seeing in Geneva at the WTO? If we don't get access to your CRMs, we will punish you by not honoring the fundamental WTO principles of the MFN and NT. So what role would SMEs have in this? Passing it due to Alicia, but also once Lisa has completed her response, I invite other panelists if they have further comments.
Well, I was looking to see, John, if, well, first of all, I want to say thanks, Mark, for that question. And he knows that's a very naughty question to ask. I'm sure he knows that. And I'm so happy to see him appear and come in and ask those questions. Mark, just to follow your principles, okay? This is being tackled very strongly from different angles, and there's a different scene here. I hope you can come and come by here one day because you need to see the scene. And one of the most important things I'm noticing is that the carrot is not in Geneva. The fake carrot is not in Geneva. And delegations like Canada, the United Kingdom, quite a few others, South Africa, India, of course, Australia. There are a number of delegations who are working their level best to deal with exactly your question. And the carrot is not in Geneva. And we're all trying to help deal with the fake carrots. And we have seen some of the interesting little things that are happening. And those of you who are trade wonks, multilateral trade wonks, and Don Stephenson and Mark, who's there, I see chiming in, and I see Dirk online. But don't just let's watch this moment. And that's all I can really say but the friends are there. Friends are everywhere. And I would say even the delegation with the carrots, or whatever it is sounding sometimes like a developing country in Geneva. And sometimes you are seeing many different iterations of members just coming together and embracing each other to figure out what is it that they are still vested in and they're committed to do. But happy, Mark, I'll pop you my contacts in the chat. But it's a good question, and we are trying our level best to be on it. And thanks to the UK and Cowater and many others who are partners and still dedicated, and even webinars like this to talk about the issues that everyone wants to stay focused on, and to recognize that one of the analyses that John mentioned that we had to do as first responders in the middle of the night in April last year was we found that the countries who are your people too, Mark, your people are not as broken up as we thought was going to happen. They recognize that when they look at their top 10, their top 20 export destinations, and John spoke about global value chains, this is where the beauty of what the WTO has done is happening, but not many are talking about it. Okay, where are your top 10 destinations? Oh, that's interesting. I don't have anything going there. Oh, that's interesting. I do have something going there, but it's on the exemption list. All right,
Mhm.
that interesting, that lovely exemption list that came out in April. Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Alicia, for the response. I'll invite Don to come in with a few thoughts as well.
Well, I think we all know who has the carrots. And let me just say that the other day we talked about the political climate, which I would describe as a little chilly, especially the climate for trade. And in my 20 years observing the trade policy environment, I've watched the temperature, steadily drop. I've watched the progression from multilateralism to plurilateralism to bilateralism and now to unilateralism. And I think the effect of that is that when I've spoken to business people, small or big, they always tell me that the most important thing is certainty, it's predictability. The certainty about the rules on which they've built their business plan, their export strategy, their investment priorities. A tariff preference is nice, but more important is confidence that the trade or business environment isn't going to change without warning, after they've made their commitment. Certainty is one of the most important objectives of trade agreements. And in the current environment, well, let's just say there's less predictability than there used to be. And I guess the opportunity in the current, fragmentation of the multilateral trading system is that a lot of countries, certainly Canada, are looking harder than ever to diversify their trade. And now's a good time to explore potential new partnerships. As I said, Canada is certainly in that category and understands that creating opportunities in non-traditional markets means reciprocity and technical assistance. And I just want to say that, bringing me back to my old loves, the survival of the multilateral trading system of the WTO isn't a given. And I think that, and I don't want to over dramatize. I know that, 3/4 of world trade is still on MFN WTO terms. But developing countries, including the countries that have your support and with your support, can use their numbers, to influence the direction of trade rules and to come to the defense of the multilateral trading system and the rules.
Thank you, Don, for that response as well, leaving us on I would say a warm note, but maybe a chillier note now. But I think you do raise some important points about the multilateral system and how it is changing today, and I do hope that answers a question. Continuing on, I encourage all of our audience to continue to ask questions, and please insert your questions into the question and answer box, and this way we can direct it towards all of our panelists here. Our next question is actually directed to Nadira, and this question comes in and says, under the AFCFTA, We often hear about opportunities for SMEs, but youth and women-led businesses still face structural barriers like access to finance, certification costs, and limited participation in value chains. From Cowater's first experience, what practical mechanisms or policy tools have you seen work in ensuring AFCFTA implementation genuinely benefits youth, women-owned MSMEs in sub-Saharan Africa beyond high-level commitments? Nadira, I'll pass to you for a response.
Yes, thank you, John. And thank you very much for the question. Of course, the AFCFTA is a historic opportunity for the continent and for all African countries, and a lot of excitement generated around the implementation of the historic agreement and, of course, the protocols on women, on digital, on women and youth in trade, and on digital trade. But at the end of the day, a trade agreement and the protocols have to be implemented. So we have a historic opportunity to implement these provisions on access to finance, on market linkages, on trade information, on intellectual property rights, competition policy, participation in formal trade activities in the AFCFTA protocol on women and youth in trade. But they need to be implemented, and who implements them? It's government. So the process that first has taken to ensure inclusive implementation of these agreements, because a project can't implement an agreement. It's a state party to agreement that can do that. We can provide the support for it. We can convene the policy dialogues that bring policymakers together with trade associations, traders themselves, civil society, research institutions, to be able to identify those policy measures, those trade measures and complementary measures, because of course it's not going to be trade policy alone that's going to ensure inclusive implementation of all of these provisions. And that's what we have done, recognizing that the project is not going to be able to deliver on all of the provisions. We have started by convening policy dialogues in all three countries, where the methodology is really ensuring that policymakers, the traders themselves, civil society, and research institutions come together to identify what are those practical measures in law, in regulation, in practice, what are the complementary skills development, educational opportunity, caregiving responsibility. How do we all bring that together in the design of practice and policy to implement each provision of the protocol? And I'm very excited to also be able to share that we will be bringing these insights and evidence together in the form of policy briefs, because we've had excellent discussions in our policy dialogues on inclusive implementation of the AFCFTA protocol on women and youth in trade and on digital trade. And it really, I mean, it's specifically for the governments of the three countries, but certainly it will hold lessons and good practice for other African countries on really inclusive implementation of these historic protocols. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much for your response, Nadira. Keeping a close eye to time, I think we may have time for a couple more questions, and both of these are actually directed at you, Nadira. So I'll pose the first one. Is that you mentioned digital barriers to trade. So this participant is wondering if digital barriers to trade, specifically in terms of violence and harassment, are issues that SMEs are experiencing globally, or is it a regional issue? Aside from educating SMEs on cybersecurity, how can digital barriers to trade be addressed? Over to you, Nadira.
Yes, thank you. I mean, of course, our research and our needs assessment and, just our, the evidence that the project is generating is specific to the three countries. But certainly, I think it supports global evidence as well as regional evidence on online violence as a significant barrier to digital trade. And what we're seeing is that it's really a whole of society approach, right? There isn't a silver bullet to addressing this. We really need to be looking at bringing government, regulators, digital platforms, civil society, women traders around to be able to look at specific actions, to be able to better understand the laws, the enforcement that needs to be provided to address digital harassment, impersonation, sextortion. How do we increase platform and operator accountability? What are the safety by design features that need to be included? How do we build just basic digital safety skills for women traders, particularly at the border and community level? And then very importantly, is an online GBV prevention in national digitalization and trade, because we're seeing these issues being understood and discussed separately. So what the project is also doing is providing support to these countries to be able to design specifically an online, addressing online violence as a barrier to digital trade, and really ensuring that it fits, that it reinforces the digital trade strategies of countries. So we're not looking at these issues in silos, included in digital trade strategies. We also want to be able to introduce the importance of community-wide education on digital rights, on consent, on online responsibility. We also want to start a discussion on investing in women's organizations, identifying digital right champions. And of course, together we talk about the importance of gender-based violence as a barrier to trade, but it's not just physical. So now we want to be able to have the conversation with policymakers about how to address online GBV prevention. How do we bring it into national trade and digitalization strategies, as well as MSME strategies? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nadira. And as we're quickly approaching time today, I know there's still some questions that have been left unanswered in the chat, but we will provide opportunities and ways to get in contact with many of our panelists today so that you can ask more of your questions and gain some of the valuable insights we've heard from today. In closing today, I think today's presentations from all of our panelists and the discussion today has been very insightful and informative, and it demonstrates Cowater's basically very diverse set of projects globally, right across from sub-Saharan Africa to Palestine, Southeast Asia, South America, and of course within the WTO itself. It has demonstrated how our programs have flexed and adapted to changing global environment, and how we can support in improving the outcomes and opportunities for SMEs. What all presenters today have demonstrated are the common issues faced by MSMEs, and we've talked about many of them. Is that we're talking about some of them: the high cost of trade, low purchasing power, the need for more information, and to improve the overall capacity and skills. But before I conclude today, I want to point out that there are still many key challenges that need to be addressed. And if I could leave a few thoughts with our audience today, and even that we could take away as food for thought for our panelists as well, is I've been noting down some of the key takeaways from today. Is that one thing that we need is, Don pointed out in his presentation, was collective action. We can't go this alone. We need to work on this together and help to address many of the challenges that SMEs are facing today. We want to leave nobody behind. Everybody needs to participate and be involved in the global trading system. Digital tools need to be accessible for everyone, and information has to be widely available. Evidence. Many of our panelists today talked about the significance and importance of evidence and information, ensuring that SMEs not only have the right information to trade, but also understanding what is in trade agreements that helps them move, and continuing to provide some of that advisory support and services, that these projects are just a small sample size of what is being provided to SMEs globally, but continuing to provide that ongoing support to SMEs to build their capacity to export, to bring them together, to ensure that the right information is there and more readily available, to have those policy dialogues, to enact policy changes that will improve the overall trading environment for SMEs. With those thoughts, I would like to sincerely thank all the panelists today for their very insightful and informative presentation and comments today. It has been an absolute pleasure to moderate this discussion today, and it's great to be back on a panel with many familiar faces. And of course, I would like to thank our audience for attending today, their participation by asking many important questions. And I do hope that everybody can take something away from today's session, and as provoke some interesting thoughts and further discussions. So once again, thank you very much for your attention today, and I do appreciate everyone's attention over the last hour, and I hope you found it very informative. So thank you, and I wish you a wonderful day. With that, I'll pass it over to Julia to close out our webinar today.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you to everyone, the audience, and of course, first and foremost, our panelists for the really engaging conversation. Not to repeat all of John's thank yous, so I also wanted to thank John for expertly moderating the discussion, and also to our Cowater comms team and to David Turney for making this webinar happen. Please stay tuned for future Cowater webinars and events, which we share through LinkedIn and via email. In particular, we invite you to join us in late February, where we will be presenting and discussing one of our latest research papers, Putting Trade and Development Objectives into Practice, which was produced through the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development program funded by Global Affairs Canada. And also, please feel free to reach out to Cowater or any of our speakers to continue the conversation and explore opportunities for collaboration. Bye for now. Thank you, everybody.